This is just a reminder that the meta in Darktide is ultimately a suggestion and not a requirement. This conversation springs up every so often, and I always feel it's important for me to remind people that there is no wrong way to play Darktide. As long as you are genuinely trying and don't grief people's games, you can play however with whatever you want. Everyone plays games differently, and some people enjoy playing with the meta, and there is nothing wrong with that. But please do not feel obligated or required to run the meta if you do not want to. The beauty of the Tide games is that builds are tools you use to express your skill rather than obstacles that limit you to a certain level of skill expression. This is because skill is the #1 determining factor of how well one can do in a game, and builds act as force multipliers for skill and allow you to express your skill with varying levels of effort. You can express your skill and do very well with both meta and non-meta builds, and you can supplement weaker builds with your own personal skill. The only difference is that you have to try a bit harder with non-meta builds. In Darktide and Vermintide 2, off-meta builds do not outright stop you from playing the game and expressing your skill. They just require you to have a slightly higher baseline of skill to pull from. The only real exception to this is Havoc mode. The current state of balance makes the meta a requirement for the vast majority of players, but it's still technically a suggestion since very high-skill players can also bypass Havoc's meta to some extent. The meta, and weapons and builds in general, also do not make a bad player suddenly good. A poor player who runs meta is still ultimately a poor player, and while they may be able to express some additional skill they would otherwise not be able to had they not run the meta, it will not allow them to compete with truly skilled players. Builds and weapons in this game are, like I said, force multipliers to skill and not flat increases to skill. The only time they do act as a flat skill increase is when they are on the extreme end of the balance spectrum, which unfortunately also happens to be the most memorable metas that everyone remembers because they're so widespread. Think on-release Bolter, or for my Vermintide players, on-release Moonbow. The metas that stem from this kind of balance, though, are ultimately destined to be undone. Metas that warp the game around them and phase out other options are not healthy for the game, and ultimately need to be removed. Which is something I'll talk about more in depth in another video, because when people hear the word nerf, they think of the fiasco of Helldiver's balance, which is nowhere near the level of nerf that needs to take place in a game like Darktide or Vermintide. We're in the middle of one of those metas right now with the dueling sword, and it's only a matter of time before it gets a slap on the wrist in some capacity. But until that happens, play with whatever you want. If you don't want to play with the dueling sword, you don't have to. Darktide is a difficult game to learn, but the fact of the matter is that the game gets significantly easier once you take the time to learn it, and that allows you the opportunity to grow and expand your skill to such a degree that you can use whatever the hell you want in these games. Focus on improving your own personal skill level, and the build variety and freedom that will eventually come will be glorious. But anyway, use what you want and have fun. If you're looking for new weapons to try out though, I did hear someone recently released an in-depth guide to the Devil's Claw swords that was pretty damn good.